Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Amiya Kumar Das, associated with the Department of Sociology, Tezpur University. Today, in this session, we are going to discuss global modernity as developed by Arif Dirlik. It is a part of contemporary social theory. Arif Dirlik is a Turkish historian who has specialized on the 20th century history of China. He left Turkey and went to United States of America to pursue physics. But during that time, because of the Chinese Revolution and Vietnamese Revolution, he was influenced by this movement and left physics to study and pursue history at the University of Rochester. Dirlik has various interest in the history of this South, and he is a prolific writer. He says that global modernity is the contradiction of capitalist modernity. In a sense, it tries to universalize itself. Globalization is not unification so much as the fragmentation of modernity. It is a really new phase, and he thinks that it has to do with the globalization of capital. Postmodernity and post-coloniality, these are two aspects of this global modernity. Dirlik tries to say that modernity, capitalism and power in a post-colonial discourse because an issue of cultural studies rather than that of political economy. It is important to note that Dirlik uses the resources of history to understand the global transformation since it will avoid ideological and metaphysical resolutions and alternatives. What is global modernity? Global modernity is a product of globalization rather than its harbinger, and it bears upon it the contradiction of history as produced it both as the realization of that history and its negation. The most crucial issue being its relationship to the colonial past. Globalization may be viewed as the process whereby modernity, capitalist modernity, has gone global, universalizing not only the material and ideological practices but also the contradictions of modernity, including the very negations of its claims to universality. Global modernity may promise liberation from the past globally, including from the past of modernity itself, but it also bears the stamp of the colonial economically, politically, socially, culturally, perpetuating the past inequalities while adding to them new one of its own. Global modernity, what Dirlik talks about, is the contradiction of this globalization, where it creates its own contradiction in the global level. That is what he talks and discusses throughout his concepts on global modernity. Dirlik provides a critical discussion on the contemporary perspective of modernity, and it can be used as a background to understand his concept of global modernity. Discussion on multiple modernities alert us about how modernity is formed. These discussions attempt to sensitize the European factor in not only making it a dominant form but also how European terrain made it dynamic, especially in fleshing out the capitalist form of modernity that was a result of particular European conditions. Dirlik notices a contradiction in the recent present state of capitalist modernity. He indicates that capitalist modernity is at its zenith. However, it has also produced revisionist ideas of modernity, cultural claims to alternate modernities. Globalization of modernity. Dirlik maps the shift of discourse from modernization to globalization in his book Global Modernity. He disaggregates the term global modernity to demonstrate what he means by the term global and modernity. In his introductory remarks, he refrains from defining globalization. However, he uses it as both paradigm and discourse to describe the historical processes of global movement of people, ideas, technologies, and products. It used it as a trope to capture the contemporary socio-political and economic imaginaries. Modernity in global modernity refers to the modernization process which emerged in the European context. The condition of global modernity in recognizing alternative claims to modernity, which is not to be confused with the alternative modernities, implies some measure of equality among the nation states. It might suggest, therefore, that unlike in an earlier era of colonialism or neo-colonialism, nations should be able to attend to demarginalizing the marginalized in order to achieve their goals of integration, development, and social coherence. Global modernity, moreover, has witnessed the recovery of the continued legitimacy, relevance, and prestige of national and civilizational tradition that has been discredited earlier under conditions of Eurocentric modernity. Here, it is suggested that various peripheral places, various marginal places which were subject to various kinds of marginalization, discrimination, and exploitation, they should try to come up to an equal level to achieve the development which is ushered by this modernization process. Dirlik constructs his concepts of global modernity in following ways: to capture the present reality that is not only a developed form of the past but also breaks from it due to differences in the claims of modernity and its future. It is understood as a singular term signifying the presence of global commonalities. It is also an attempt to overcome the teleological assumptions of globalization process. Globalization is seen from the perspective of colonial past, colonial modernity, rather than seeing colonialism as a phase of globalization. The features of global modernity that can be used to distinguish it from earlier forms of modernity and globalization are: global modernity is the resting place of globalization. Unlike earlier forms of modernity, Eurocentric modernity, global modernity is marked by temporal contemporaneity. Globalization of capitalism has reconfigured specialization of global relations. Groups of people across nation states are being left out of the global economy and global modernity tries to capture it. Dirlik identifies that the global modernity indicates the end of colonialism due to decolonization. However, it continues in the present in the form of colonial modernity. Colonial modernity persists through the mechanics of capitalist modernity. Colonial modernity, what Dirlik argues, is the part of capitalist modernity, and it continuously trying to reproduce it and sustain it through this capitalist modernity. For Dirlik, this capitalism is the main source and initiation of modernity which is being continued through its expansion and strength. Dirlik argues that modernity is a product of historical processes and he locates modernity in the global scale. Thereby, he coins the terms global modernity. In theorizing modernity in these terms, Dirlik disagrees with the theorization of modernity in different forms, like theorists have proposed the idea of multiple or alternative modernities. He says modernity is started and produced in the European context. With the help of capital or capitalist modernity through the globalization process, it traveled all over the world and it became global modernity. He negates with the idea where the theorists suggest that modernity is also evolved in the local areas and the peripheral areas through the local context. But he says with conviction, it is not the modernity produced in the local peripheral places, but it is the modernity originated in the European context through this colonial modernity. It interacted with the local places, and with the help of capital expansion, it became global. Thereby, he coins the term global modernity. So, he suggests that neither modernity nor globalization end due to the various problems which were raised earlier. However, globalization has provided a platform for the subjects of colonial modernity and the modernization process to assert themselves. The negotiation among the differently placed nations are mediated by the process of capitalism and have led to the global modernity. Dirlik points out that the term Global South or the Third World was a term coined by Alfred Sauvy in 1952 to describe formerly colonized countries from the capitalist and socialist countries. When compared to the Third World, Global South indicates a different global order. The Third World, as suggested earlier, was used to refer to those countries that are neither capitalist nor socialist in its orientation and had a choice between these two alternatives. Whereas Global South indicates a north-south division of the global order, with capitalist modernity or neoliberalism being the only alternative. Those two terms therefore indicate a shift in the global relations of capitalism and domination. Global capitalist processes, especially globalization, has accelerated interconnection of many nation states and countries. Even though the global order of domination is still under the control of the West, in the context of globalization and capital flow from one region to another, even countries and places in the southern world have flourished. And at the same time, in the northern world, we have seen places which are not that rich. In this opportunity of globalization and capital flow, we can see that place like China, where Arif Dirlik, he focuses his interest and gives the example of how, without losing its national interest, China or the Chinese model could flourish and create development for itself. Basically, in these processes of global modernity or globalization process, he tries to link up that issue to this capital modernity or capitalist modernity, where he mentions all the issues and he negates the idea of multiple modernities or alternate modernities. His main focus is on the how the way Eurocentric modernity became local, not in terms of local form of modernity, but when it interacted with the local context and took a form of modernity. But his main argument is there, in essence, this modernity is Eurocentric. We do not have multiple forms of modernity or alternative modernities. Because the advent of this capital or new capital, or we can say neoliberalism, how these places or countries even in peripheral region could prosper with the help of the capital, and they could show to the whole world that with the help of capital, with the help of linkages, with the help of globalization process, without hampering its national interest, how a country can prosper. To sum up this whole idea of global modernity, Arif Dirlik at the same time critical about the whole idea of Eurocentric modernity, but at the same time he suggests that we are not yet ready, or we have not come out of the larger framework of modernity, which is essentially European, but we, whatever kind of modernities we see, these are linked to the basic idea of modernity, which is originated from the Europe. And in the largest context, he describes the flow of ideas, technologies, and everything in his concepts called global modernity.
I hope it's clear from my discussion above of the search for a Chinese discursive system that even the effort to eliminate the influence of so-called Western discourse resorts to a conceptual vocabulary provided by the Latin. This does not mean that there are no real differences among peoples, but it does suggest that those differences be viewed at all times also through the commonalities which are also a pervasive presence. It seems deeply ironic that economic and to some extent social and cultural globalization should signal the end of universalism, but it is not very surprising. Political universals follow the logic not of philosophy but of power and hegemony. Globalization may have been intended to complete the conquest of the globe for the capitalist modernity that for nearly half a millennium had empowered Euro-American domination. Capitalist modernity has emerged victorious, but contrary to expectations, rather than buttress the existing centers of hegemony, its benefits have gone mostly to challengers who now make their own claims on global power and hegemony. In the process, denying the universality of value and knowledge claims that for 2 centuries have denied recognition to their intellectual and cultural inheritances. The denial of universality is at bottom little more than the denial of Euro-American hegemony in search of intellectual and ethical sovereignty, with the exception of the PRC, I think, whose aspirations suggest not just a defense of nationalism, but alternative global designs. It might be useful here to recall 2 competing metaphors that appeared in the 1990s almost simultaneously that have a direct bearing on this question. The clash of civilizations put forward by the late Samuel Huntington and hybridization that has had a central place in postcolonial criticism. We can see both paradigms at work in the contemporary world, albeit in different mixes and subject to local inflections. It is interesting that both paradigms criticize the Eurocentric universalism, if for different reasons. Huntington's exclusivist culturalism led him to advocate hardened cultural boundaries for the reason that others did not or could not share the values the West considered universal. Postcolonial criticism, on the other hand, perceived in hybridity the possibility of rendering cultural boundaries porous as a first step in the recognition of cultures only unsuccessfully suppressed under Euro-modernity, and offering the possibility of exchange and negotiation between different cultural entities once they had achieved some measure of equivalence. Radical critics have have understandably been drawn to the latter alternative, and in the process ignored the appeals of the clash paradigm among patriotic groups, including leftist patriotic groups in countries like China, where memories of revolutionary anti-imperials survive the abandonment of revolution. The puzzling attraction to Philip Schmitter's friend-enemy distinction among such groups appears more easily comprehensible when taken in conjunction with the Huntingtonian anticipation of clash if and when these groups emerge from under the hegemony of Western civilization, which they already seem to be doing when he offered this paradigm in the early 1990s. The clash paradigm has insistently moved to the foreground over the last 2 decades. The hybrid paradigm is by no means dead, but its vulnerabilities have also become increasingly evident. Cultural hybrids are not things as they may appear in their biological counterparts, like nectarines, as it were, but complexes of relationships and contradictions, the resolution of which depends on concrete historical circumstances. Put bluntly, depending on context, hybrids may end up on the political right or the left, or anywhere on a broad spectrum of possibilities. The stress in much post-colonial criticism on hybridity along ethnic, national, or civilizational boundaries, moreover, invites reification of these categories, distracting attention from the differences and hybridities in their very constitution. In a global environment of counter-revolutionary shift to the right, combined with nostalgia for lost imperial greatness, pressures to exclusionary culturalism along these boundaries are quite powerful, despite intensifying transnationalism propelled by a globalizing capitalism. This may be seen, for example, in the growth of diasporic nationalism in closer identification with nations of origin, especially in the case of countries such as the PRC, India, and Turkey, which have registered impressive success in their ability to employ globalization to national ends. What these changes imply for critical practice is worth pondering. Globalization insistently forces into one common intellectual space diverse conversations on knowledge and values. It creates commonalities, but also differences that challenge assumptions of universality in hegemonic societies that long have been able to treat alternative voices as a minor nuisance. Comparisons between the present and Cold War conflicts are widely off the mark. Cold War confrontations between capitalism and socialism presupposed competing political economic spatialities, but shared common assumptions about universality. Socialism assumed national form, to be sure, but we may recall that differences between existing socialist societies were voiced in the language of revisionism, suggesting deviation from a political project informed by universal principles. To take the case of the Chinese Revolution, when revolutionaries in the 1940s began to insist on making Marxism Chinese, the project was conceived as the integration of the universal principles of Marxism with the concrete circumstances of Chinese society. The phrase is still commonplace in ideological discourse in post-revolutionary PRC, but more as a fading trace from the past than a meaningful guide to the future. The globalization of capitalism has abolished the competing spaces of political economy. Differences are expressed instead in claims to alternative cultural spaces. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is above all a cultural idea. yoked to aspirations of national rejuvenation that are conspicuously suspicious of universality. To speak of revisionism in our day would no doubt seem farcically anachronistic. The global space capitalism claim in the aftermath of the Cold War is already fragmenting under pressure from claims of cultural difference, empowered by reconfigurations of the capitalist world economy. If universalism persists as a goal, it can no longer be phrased in the same terms as it was under the hegemony of Euro-modernity, but will have to be formulated out of contemporary conversations that now include voices silenced or marginalized under the regime of Euro-modernity. Rescuing alternative knowledge and value systems from the erasures of Euro-modernity has been part and parcel of radical critical thinking since the 1960s, nourished by a very universalist belief in the possibility of human diversity. This task is much more complicated than it may appear. What these alternative knowledge and value systems consist of has been open to question all along, whether we speak of the cultures of women, ethnicities, indigenous peoples, or nations and civilizations. The traditions that identified nations and civilizations in Euro-American modernization discourses were reified misrepresentations of complex intellectual and cultural legacies, often with blurred boundaries between the inside and the outside. Diversity in these societies is erased by a multiculturalism that similarly identifies authentic cultural identity with reified traditions. The relationship to Euro-modernity has been equally complicated. After 2 centuries of global revolutionary transformation, it is hardly possible to speak of East, West, Asia, Europe, Chinese, Western, etc., as if they were mutually exclusive cultural entities. The cultural identities that are ascribed to Chineseness, Hinduism, Islam, or even more crudely, continental entities like Asia and Europe are ironically legacies of Euro-modern reification of these cultural entities. Their defense, equally notably, draws upon the language of critical analysis that is rejected for being Western.
For more information, kindly log on to the website of EPG Pathshala, where you will get more information, readings, e-text, and references. Thank you.